6 years after my younger sister stole my fiancé, she walked into our mother's funeral wearing my old engagement ring. Melissa had always known I was married. What she did not know was the identity of the man I had married. That morning, my husband had stepped away to speak with the funeral director when Melissa entered on Ethan Caldwell's arm. She was dressed in designer black, diamonds at her ears, her posture composed for an audience that existed only in her mind. She looked around the room, found me standing alone and smiled. 38, married. And your husband still let you come alone? I glanced at the 5-carat ring on her hand, the same ring my attorney had returned to Ethan after I caught them together. I didn't come alone. Before she could respond, my husband returned. He rested one hand gently against my back. Everything is ready, love. Melissa's smile weakened. So this is the mysterious husband no one ever talks about. Then Ethan turned. He looked at Daniel, and every trace of color disappeared from his face. His fingers released Melissa's waist. His shoulders stiffened. For the first time since I had known him, Ethan Caldwell seemed unable to manufacture the expression he wanted the world to see. Daniel regarded him calmly. Ethan. Ethan swallowed. You. Melissa looked from her husband to mine. What is going on? Neither man answered immediately. But I already knew. Ethan was not frightened because Daniel had married the woman he once betrayed. He was frightened because he finally understood who Daniel was. And what Daniel knew about the business empire Ethan had spent years pretending still existed. To explain that moment, I have to take you back 6 years to the life I believed was perfect, the sister I trusted, and the office door I should have opened much sooner. At 32, I had almost everything I had spent my adult life working toward. I was a marketing director for a national consumer brand headquartered in Boston. I led a team of talented people, presented strategies to executives twice my age, and earned enough to buy a beautiful apartment overlooking the Charles River. I was not famous. I was not born rich. But I had built a life that felt entirely mine. Then Ethan Caldwell entered it, and made that life appear complete. Ethan was the founder of Caldwell Technologies, a Boston software company that had grown quickly enough to attract business reporters, private investors, and the type of people who described every successful young man as a visionary. He was charming without appearing rehearsed. He remembered birthdays, names, and fragments of conversations that made people feel important. When he focused on you, the rest of the room seemed to fade. That was how he made me feel during the first 2 years of our relationship. He proposed aboard a private yacht in Boston Harbor. The city lights shimmered across the water as he placed a 5-carat oval diamond on my finger. You will never have to wonder where you stand with me, he promised. I believed that sentence because I wanted to believe the man saying it. My younger sister, Melissa, was the first person I called. She screamed, cried, and demanded photographs of the ring from every possible angle. I knew he would choose you, she said. At the time, I did not notice the strange emphasis she placed on the word choose. Melissa and I had never had an easy relationship. I was 4 years older and had spent most of my childhood behaving like a second parent whenever our mother was busy. I helped Melissa with homework, defended her when she got into trouble, and covered for her more times than I should have. But as we grew older, care turned into comparison. I was organized. Melissa was impulsive. I built confidence through preparation. Melissa learned how to command attention through beauty, emotion, and crisis. When I graduated with honors, she announced at dinner that academic achievement was overrated. When I received my first promotion, she stopped returning my calls for a week. When I bought my apartment, she joked that successful women usually ended up alone because men preferred someone less exhausting. I told myself her comments came from insecurity rather than cruelty. She was my sister. I believed loving her meant understanding the wounds beneath her behavior. That was why I asked her to be my maid of honor. For the first few months, the wedding seemed to repair something between us. Melissa attended dress fittings, reviewed flowers, and argued with caterers on my behalf. She sent photographs of table settings late at night and created spreadsheets for vendors, even though she had mocked my obsession with organization for years. When work became overwhelming, she offered to attend appointments I could not make. Sometimes Ethan went with her. At first, I was grateful. Then small details began to disturb me. One evening, Melissa mentioned that Ethan was considering reducing the engineering budget to strengthen the company's acquisition proposal. I looked at him. "You never told me that." Ethan shrugged. "It is boring business." Melissa laughed. "He tells me because I actually ask." The words sounded playful, but her eyes remained on me. During dinner at our parents' home, she touched his arm while laughing at one of his stories. Her fingers lingered after the laughter ended. Ethan did not move away. My mother noticed. Judith Brennan had a quiet way of observing people. She rarely accused anyone directly because she understood that an accusation often caused people to defend themselves before they examined the truth. Later that evening, while we reviewed the wedding guest list, she asked, "Are you comfortable with how much time Melissa and Ethan are spending together?" I looked toward the living room. They sat on opposite sides of the couch, studying something on Ethan's tablet. "They are helping with the wedding." "I know." "Then what are you suggesting?" "I am not suggesting anything. I am reminding you that trusting people does not require you to ignore your instincts." I forced a smile. "Mom, Melissa has been competing with me since childhood. That does not mean she wants my fiancé." Judith folded the guest list. "No, but wanting what you have has always been easier for your sister than deciding what she wants for herself." I did not sleep well that night. By morning, I had convinced myself that my mother was reacting to old family patterns. Ethan loved me. Melissa was simply enjoying the attention of being involved in an expensive wedding. There was another reason I dismissed my concern. Ethan was under enormous pressure at work. Caldwell Technologies was pursuing the acquisition of Synex, a software company that owned several valuable patents and a loyal base of corporate clients. Ethan believed buying Synex would turn his company from a promising regional business into a major national competitor. He spoke about the acquisition with the intensity of a man discussing his survival. At first, he shared every detail. Then Northbridge Capital entered the bidding process. After that, Ethan became secretive. One night, I entered the kitchen while he was speaking sharply on the phone. "I know what I signed," he said, "but if Northbridge wins Synex, everything changes." He turned and saw me. The call ended immediately. "What did you sign?" I asked. "Financing documents." "What kind?" "Nothing you need to worry about." "You sound worried." "I am irritated." He crossed the kitchen and kissed my forehead. "Northbridge is an investment firm with more money than imagination. They think they can buy anything." "Can they?" His jaw tightened. "Not Synex." Over the following weeks, Ethan began working late. Our Friday dinners were canceled. His phone stayed face down. He took calls in the guest bedroom and claimed they involved overseas investors. Melissa also became difficult to reach on the evenings Ethan was supposedly trapped at the office. I noticed the pattern. Then I criticized myself for noticing it. I did not want to become a suspicious woman searching for betrayal in ordinary coincidences. Love required trust, I reminded myself. Marriage could not survive constant doubt. One Tuesday, Ethan texted that he would be working past midnight. We had planned a weekend trip, so I decided to clean his car before packing. As I reached between the passenger seat and the center console, my fingers touched something metallic. I pulled out a silver earring with a sapphire hanging from the hook. I recognized it immediately. Our grandmother had given Melissa the pair on her 21st birthday. Melissa had worn them at our engagement party. For several minutes, I remained inside Ethan's parked car, with the earring resting in my palm. The guarded phone. The late nights. The perfume I had smelled on his collar. The details Melissa knew about Synex. The way they had shifted apart whenever I entered a room. Each memory rearranged itself. I wanted to call Melissa and demand an explanation. Instead, I slipped the earring into my handbag. I would not accuse either of them. I would find the truth. And 3 days later, I walked into Ethan's office, carrying his favorite lunch. The receptionist knew me well enough to recognize that I was not expected. "Laura," she said, rising slightly from her chair. "I did not know you were coming. I brought Ethan lunch." Her gaze moved toward the corridor leading to his office. "He is in a meeting." "I can wait." He asked not to be disturbed. That sentence removed the last of my hesitation. I walked past her desk. No one tried to physically stop the owner's fiancé from entering his office. The door was closed. I heard movement inside, but no conversation. I opened it without knocking. Melissa stood between Ethan and his desk. Her hands were in his hair. His arms were wrapped around her waist. They were kissing with the familiarity of people who had repeated the act enough times to stop listening for footsteps. For a few seconds, neither noticed me. Then the door closed behind me. Ethan looked up first. His face collapsed. Laura. Melissa stepped away and adjusted her blouse. She did not look ashamed. She looked annoyed that the secret had ended before she was ready. Ethan moved toward me. Do not insult me by finishing that sentence. My voice sounded strangely calm. I placed the lunch bag on his desk. Then I removed the sapphire earring from my handbag and set it beside the food. I found this in your car. Melissa stared at it. I wondered where that went. Her casual tone cut more deeply than denial would have. How long? Ethan looked down. Melissa did not. Since after the engagement party. Nearly 6 months. For nearly 6 months, she had attended dress fittings, discussed flowers, and asked whether I wanted lace or silk napkins while sleeping with the man waiting at the altar. You helped me plan the wedding. Melissa crossed her arms. We did not plan for this to happen. You scheduled appointments with him. You were always working. There it was. Not remorse. Justification. As though my career had created a vacancy she was entitled to occupy. Ethan reached for my arm. I stepped away. I love you, he said. The absurdity almost made me laugh. You do not know what that word means. He began talking quickly. He said the affair was complicated. He said Melissa understood the pressure surrounding cynics. He said our relationship had become predictable and that I was rarely emotionally available. Every sentence converted his choices into consequences of my personality. I looked at the man I had intended to marry and finally saw what ambition had allowed me to overlook. Ethan did not fear hurting people. He feared losing control of what they believed about him. I removed my engagement ring. His eyes followed the diamond. For 1 second, I considered placing it on the desk. Then I closed my fingers around it. No. He frowned. What? My attorney will return it. I want proof that you received it. Melissa gave a short laugh. Always so formal. I looked at her. You should be grateful. Formality is the only reason I am leaving without saying everything you deserve to hear. Then I walked out. The following week became a series of humiliating administrative tasks. I canceled the venue, the caterer, the photographer, the florist. Every stranger offered sympathy, and every expression of sympathy made the betrayal feel more public. Ethan called repeatedly. His first messages contained apologies. The later ones contained impatience. He wanted to discuss deposits, mutual friends, and the story we would tell the business community. Melissa sent one message. You cannot force someone to love you. Someday, I hope you understand. I did not respond. My attorney returned the ring to Ethan's office by insured courier. 2 days later, I received written confirmation bearing the signature of his assistant. I placed the document in a folder and closed it. My parents came to my apartment. Thomas wanted to confront Ethan. Judith stopped him because she understood that violence would turn Ethan into a victim in the only story that mattered to him, the public one. My mother found me sitting on the bathroom floor. She held me while I cried for a relationship that had apparently ended months before anyone thought to inform me. The strangest part was that I cried more for Melissa. Ethan had betrayed the woman he intended to marry. Melissa had betrayed the sister who had defended her for a lifetime. For 6 months, I attended therapy. I took leave from work and returned gradually. I learned that humiliation could transform ordinary places into traps. The restaurant where Ethan proposed, the bridal boutique, the street outside his office. Boston became a map of emotional injuries. Judith tried to prevent the family from breaking completely. She invited both daughters to holiday dinners and suggested short meetings in neutral places. I refused until the 4th of July. That afternoon, I went to my parents' house because my mother asked me to try once. Melissa arrived holding Ethan's hand. She wore both sapphire earrings, including the one I had found in his car. The sight was deliberate. She had turned evidence into a trophy. Neither she nor Ethan apologized. Ethan behaved as though time had converted betrayal into legitimacy. Melissa acted as though winning him proved she had always been the better choice. I stayed less than 20 minutes. By the time I reached my car, I knew I could not heal while being repeatedly asked to stand beside the people who had wounded me. 3 weeks later, I applied for an internal transfer to Chicago. The position was a promotion. Regional Marketing Director, responsible for several major accounts across the Midwest. I accepted before fear could argue. My mother helped me pack. My father carried boxes in silence. On the morning of my flight, I drove to the apartment Melissa now shared with Ethan. I left a sealed envelope outside the door. Inside was one sentence. When you lose everything, remember that you once had a sister who would have given you the world. At the airport, a business notification appeared on my phone. Northbridge Capital had become the preferred bidder for Cinex. I remembered Ethan's voice in the kitchen. If Northbridge wins, everything changes. Then my flight was called. I closed the article and walked toward the gate. I believed I was leaving Ethan, Melissa, and Cinex behind. I did not know that another person connected to that transaction would soon enter my life. Chicago gave me something Boston could not: anonymity. No one knew why my engagement had ended. No one lowered their voice when I entered a room. No one had seen Melissa stand beside Ethan while I tried to remember how to breathe. My new apartment was smaller than the one I left, but every object inside it belonged only to the life I had chosen. The first year was difficult. I woke from dreams in which I opened Ethan's office door again and again. I watched other people's phones when they turned them face down. I mistook silence for concealment and privacy for betrayal. Therapy helped me understand that healing did not mean returning to the woman I had been before. That woman believed trust guaranteed safety. The woman I was becoming understood that trust was a choice supported by evidence, consistency, and boundaries. I met Daniel Whitmore at a marketing innovation conference. He was introduced as an investor and advisor who worked with companies facing acquisitions, reputational crises, and long-term brand challenges. He stood at the front of the room without dramatic slides or rehearsed jokes. He spoke about loyalty. Customers do not trust a company because the company demands trust, he said. They trust it because consistent behavior gives them evidence. The sentence stayed with me. After the session, I waited to thank him. I appreciated what you said about consistency. He smiled. Most people prefer the idea that one grand gesture can repair years of neglect. Can it? No. The simplicity of his answer surprised me. We spoke for several minutes about marketing, leadership, and the difference between visibility and credibility. There was no obvious flirting. That made me comfortable enough to accept his business card. A week later, he emailed and asked whether I wanted to continue the conversation over coffee. I almost declined. Then I decided fear had already taken enough from me. Daniel arrived early, but ordered nothing for me. I do not know what you like, he explained. You could have guessed. Guessing someone's preferences is often more about appearing thoughtful than actually being thoughtful. I laughed. Our friendship developed slowly. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became long walks by the river. Daniel did not demand details about my past, but he noticed when certain subjects changed my expression. Several months after we met, I told him about Ethan and Melissa. I did not dramatize the story. I stated the facts, as if emotional distance could protect me from them. When I finished, Daniel remained silent. Then he said, "My former wife had an affair with my business partner." I looked at him. They left together? Yes. What happened to the company? I bought out his interest. It nearly destroyed us financially. He spoke without bitterness. How did you forgive them? I did not. The answer surprised me. I stopped allowing what they did to determine who I became. That is not the same as forgiveness. From that night, something changed between us. Daniel understood that pain could remain present without controlling every conversation. He never treated me as fragile. He also never used patience as a strategy to earn access to me. When I needed space, he gave it. When I reached for him, he stayed. Months passed before we called what we were doing a relationship. Even then, I watched for signs that he would become someone else once he felt secure. He did not. He remembered that I disliked red roses and loved white peonies. He never arrived late without warning. When he apologized, he did not attach explanations designed to erase responsibility. One evening, I mentioned that Ethan had been pursuing a company called Cinex when our relationship ended. Daniel's fork stopped briefly above his plate. Caldwell Technologies was his company? Yes. I knew of it professionally. What did you know? That it was under pressure. The answer was vague, but not obviously suspicious. I had deliberately avoided following Ethan's business after leaving Boston. I did not want his success or failure to become part of my healing. Daniel did not volunteer more. That decision would later become the first serious test of our relationship. Nearly a year after we met, Daniel took me to a botanical garden as the first spring flowers opened. We walked beneath flowering trees until we reached a quiet path surrounded by wisteria. He stopped and took both my hands. "Loving you has taught me that peace is not the absence of history," he said. "It is finding someone who does not use that history against you." He opened a small velvet box. Inside was an emerald ring, framed by 2 modest diamonds. My eyes filled with tears. Then, before he asked the question, he closed the box. His face had changed. "There is something I should have told you earlier." My hands became cold. "What?" "It concerns Ethan Caldwell and Cinex." The garden seemed to disappear around us. Daniel did not reach for me when I stepped back. "Before you decide whether to marry me," he said, "you deserve to know what role I played in the deal that changed Ethan's company." We sat on a bench beneath the wisteria, while Daniel told me the truth. Northbridge Capital was not merely a company he advised. He had founded it. Years earlier, after buying out the partner who betrayed him, Daniel rebuilt the business under a new name. Northbridge specialized in acquisitions and long-term investments in technology companies. It had competed directly against Caldwell Technologies for Cinex. "I led the Northbridge bid," Daniel said. The words settled between us. I looked at the closed ring box in his hand. "You knew Ethan?" "Professionally. We met during the bidding process, and after I told you his name, I recognized the connection." "How long ago?" "Several months after we met." I stood. Daniel remained seated. "You let me continue dating you without telling me." "Yes." The honesty did not reduce the impact. "Why?" "At first, I believed the connection was irrelevant. The transaction happened before I met you. Later, I understood that it mattered because it was connected to your history. But you still waited." "I did." He did not defend the delay. "That made it harder to place him beside Ethan, but easier to fear that I might be repeating the same mistake in a more sophisticated form." "What happened to Ethan's company?" Daniel looked toward the path. "Ethan built Caldwell Technologies' growth strategy around acquiring Cinex. He secured a bridge loan to demonstrate that his company could finance the deal." "What is a bridge loan?" "Short-term financing. Expensive financing. It was intended to cover the period before longer-term funds became available." "And if he lost Cinex?" "He was supposed to have a contingency plan." "Did he?" "Not a realistic one." Daniel explained that Ethan had expanded Caldwell Technologies too quickly. He hired employees, leased additional offices, and promised investors that Cinex's future revenue would support the debt he was accumulating. Part of the financing included a personal guarantee. If the company failed to meet certain obligations, Daniel said, Ethan could become personally responsible for part of the debt. "Did you know that when you bid against him?" "Not at the beginning. Some of the risk became clear during due diligence. More became public during the restructuring that followed." "Did you destroy him?" Daniel met my eyes. "No." The answer came without hesitation. Northbridge submitted a stronger offer. Our financing was committed. Ethan's depended on projections Cinex's board considered unrealistic. They selected us. And after he lost? Investors withdrew. Lenders imposed stricter conditions. Caldwell Technologies violated financial covenants and sold several divisions to remain operational. "Ethan blamed you." "He blamed Northbridge publicly." "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel looked at the ring box. "Because I did not want your pain to become proof of my victory." "That sounds noble." It was not. He stood, but kept distance between us. I should have told you as soon as I recognized the connection. I convinced myself that withholding something was different from lying. It was a distinction that benefited me. That sentence stopped me. Ethan would have explained why his secrecy was my fault. Daniel named his own self-interest. Still, truth did not erase consequence. I need time. You have it. He did not ask how much. He placed the ring box on the bench. It will be there if you want it. If you do not, I will understand. I left the garden alone. For 2 weeks, I did not see him. He sent one message. I am sorry I waited. I will answer any question you choose to ask. No flowers. No pressure. No attempt to persuade my friends that I was overreacting. I spoke with my therapist and admitted that I could not tell whether my fear belonged to Daniel's choice or Ethan's memory. It can belong to both, she said. The important question is whether Daniel responds to the harm he caused or only to the possibility of losing you. So I investigated. I read articles about the Synex acquisition. I reviewed Caldwell Technologies' restructuring. I contacted a former colleague who understood corporate finance. The public documents showed that Caldwell Technologies had been financially unstable before Synex chose Northbridge. Ethan had taken on debt based on projected future revenue. He had expanded before securing the acquisition that was supposed to justify the expansion. The personal guarantee itself was not originally public. But during Caldwell Technologies' restructuring, a lender sued to enforce part of the agreement. A copy of the guarantee appeared as an exhibit in the court filing. I found Ethan's signature at the bottom. I stared at it for a long time. Daniel had not signed the document that placed Ethan's future at risk. Ethan had. I also found an old interview in which Ethan described Northbridge as predatory and claimed powerful investors had conspired to eliminate entrepreneurs like him. The article did not mention that his company had entered the transaction over-leveraged. I called Daniel. Did you know he could lose millions? I knew the restructuring would be severe. I did not know the full extent of his personal exposure. Did what he did to me influence any business decision? No. Northbridge completed the acquisition before I met you. Would you have told me if you were not planning to propose? Silence followed. I want to say yes, he answered. I cannot prove that. His answer hurt. It also sounded honest. We met the following evening. Daniel did not bring the ring. Why not? Because tonight is not about getting the answer I want. I told him that if we continued, delayed honesty could not become a pattern. No withholding information that might alter the other person's choices. No deciding what the other person could handle. No protection through omission. Daniel agreed. Then he said, You do not owe me another chance because I admitted I was wrong. I know. What happens now? I looked at the man who had disappointed me and then allowed me to examine that disappointment without resistance. Ethan had hidden the truth to preserve control. Daniel had revealed it knowing the truth might cost him everything he wanted. That difference mattered. Now, I said, you ask me properly. The following weekend, we returned to the botanical garden. This time, Daniel opened the box without a speech. Laura Brennan, will you marry me? Yes. When he placed the emerald ring on my finger, I thought about the diamond I had returned to Ethan. The first ring had been designed to announce value. The second represented a choice made after truth. I did not yet know that years later, both rings would appear in the same room. Only one would represent a life that was real. Daniel and I married 6 months later in a restored chapel in Chicago. The ceremony was small. My parents attended, along with Daniel's sister, close friends and a few colleagues who had become family during my years away from Boston. Melissa was not invited. Judith did not ask me to reconsider. I want both my daughters in my life, she told me, but I will not demand that one of you sacrifice her safety to create the appearance of peace. My father walked me down the aisle. Daniel waited beneath a simple arrangement of white flowers. There were no reporters, no business photographers, and no public announcement. Daniel's position at Northbridge was known in investment circles, but he did not build his identity around public attention. We shared a few wedding photographs with our parents and close friends. I asked them not to send the photographs to Melissa. She knew I had married. Judith had told her that much. But she did not know my husband's full name or professional identity. At the time, I did not make that request to create a future surprise. I simply did not want Melissa studying my new marriage as another object of competition. Daniel respected that boundary. Our marriage was not dramatic. That became one of the things I valued most about it. We argued about travel schedules, household responsibilities, and the fact that Daniel believed an empty refrigerator still contained several possible meals. But our disagreements did not become contests over who could wound the other more deeply. When Daniel worked late, he told me where he was and why. When I traveled for client work, I did not use professional demands to avoid difficult conversations. We learned that a healthy relationship was not one without pain. It was one in which pain did not become a weapon. I kept Brennan professionally. Daniel never asked me to change it. Over the following years, my career shifted from corporate marketing into brand strategy consulting. I advised companies facing leadership changes, acquisitions, and public crises. Daniel joked that I helped businesses tell the truth clearly, while Northbridge forced them to confront the expensive parts. We also tried to have a child. At first, every month carried optimism. Then optimism became caution. Appointments followed, tests, treatment. Hope arrived repeatedly and disappeared before we allowed ourselves to name it. After one painful appointment, I sat in the car and apologized. For what? Daniel asked. For not being able to give you the family we planned. He turned toward me. You are my family. I know, but... No. His voice remained gentle. Whatever shape our family takes, you are not the unfinished part. I carried that sentence with me. My contact with Boston remained limited but steady. I called my parents every Sunday. Judith occasionally mentioned Melissa. She and Ethan married 2 years after I left Boston. The wedding photographs appeared in a society magazine. Melissa wore a designer gown. Beneath the new wedding band on her finger sat the 5-carat engagement ring Ethan had once given me. When I saw the image, I felt less pain than I expected. The ring looked like evidence from someone else's trial. Melissa's public life appeared perfect. A large house near Beacon Hill. Luxury vehicles. Charity galas. Trips to Europe. Every photograph seemed constructed to communicate that she had won. Judith rarely commented. Once, she said, "Photographs are very good at showing what people want witnessed." What does that mean? It means your sister is not as happy as she wants everyone to believe. I did not ask for details. I had spent years learning not to build my peace around Melissa's consequences. Still, small questions began reaching me. Judith asked whether I knew where the family kept Melissa's original birth certificate. Another time, she wanted the name of an accountant who had once helped me obtain old tax records. Why does Melissa need those? She is organizing her documents. The explanation sounded ordinary. I forgot about it. Several months later, Judith told me Melissa had begun visiting more often. Does Ethan come with her? Usually. Do you see her alone? A pause followed. Sometimes. The answer did not sound convincing. Then Judith changed the subject. That winter, Daniel and I decided to pause fertility treatment. Not forever. Long enough to remember how to live without every month becoming an examination. We traveled less, ate dinner at home more often, and learned that grief could exist beside gratitude without canceling it. One Saturday morning, I was making coffee when Judith called. Her voice sounded weaker than it had the previous Sunday. "Laura, I need to tell you something." I sat down. "What happened?" "I have pancreatic cancer." The room became silent except for the refrigerator. "How long have you known?" 3 months. 3 months? I did not want you flying back and forth while the doctors were still deciding what could be done. And now? Her breath trembled. Now they are not discussing treatment anymore. Daniel entered the kitchen and knew from my face that something had changed. "How much time?" I asked. "The doctor will not say exactly. Mum, weeks. Maybe less." I closed my eyes. "I'm coming home. You do not have to. I am coming." Daniel was already searching for flights. Judith began crying quietly. "There is something else," she said. "What?" Your sister has been trying to find her way back to herself. I did not understand. Before I could ask, my mother whispered, "Please, come soon." Daniel and I flew to Boston the following morning. My father met us at the house. Thomas had always seemed larger than the rooms he entered. Now grief had reduced him. His shoulders curved inward, and exhaustion sat heavily beneath his eyes. "She is awake," he said, "but she tires quickly." I walked down the hallway toward my parents' bedroom. An oxygen machine hummed beside the bed. Judith turned her head when I entered. Her face was pale and thinner than I remembered, but her eyes remained sharp. "My girl." I knelt beside her. "I'm here." Daniel stayed near the doorway until she called him closer. "So this is the man whose photographs no one is allowed to send to Melissa." Daniel smiled. "That was Laura's rule. A sensible one." She took his hand. "Thank you for taking care of my daughter." Daniel shook his head. "She takes care of herself. I am fortunate enough to stand beside her." Judith looked at me. "Keep him." We had 9 days. During those 9 days, my mother and I spoke about everything except the fact that the conversations were ending. She asked about Chicago, my career, and the apartment Daniel and I had recently moved into. She wanted to know whether I still owned the ugly ceramic bowl I made at school. I did. She apologized for the family dinners she tried to arrange after the betrayal. "I thought if I could place both of you in the same room, I could remind you that you were sisters. You were trying to hold the family together. I was trying to control an outcome because I could not bear the truth." "What truth?" "That loving people does not give us the power to repair them." One afternoon, she mentioned Melissa. "I am not asking you to forgive her." I looked toward the window. "Then what are you asking?" "Do not let what she did make every future decision for you." "It doesn't. Not anymore." Her fingers tightened around mine. "That may be why you can hear something now that you could not hear before." "What?" "That must be Melissa's truth to tell." The answer frustrated me. But I would not pressure a dying woman to violate another daughter's confidence. Melissa called twice during those 9 days. The first time, Ethan answered her phone. "Laura," he said, as though our last meaningful conversation had not occurred 6 years earlier. "Put Melissa on. She is driving." "I can wait." He gave a small laugh. "You have not changed." I ended the call. Melissa called back 10 minutes later. Her voice was quiet. "Mom said you came." "Yes." "How is she?" "You should visit her." "I will." "Alone?" Silence followed. "I do not know." I heard movement in the background. Then Ethan's voice, too low to understand. Melissa said, "I have to go." The call ended. When I told Judith, she looked tired rather than surprised. "Ethan does not like her talking to people without him." "Why?" "He calls it transparency." Daniel, who had been reading near the window, looked up. I recognized the concern in his expression. The next time Melissa visited, Ethan drove her. He waited outside for several minutes, then entered and announced that they needed to leave. Melissa stood immediately. As she hugged our mother, her phone rang inside Ethan's hand. I noticed he was carrying it. He saw me looking. "Melissa loses things," he said with a smile. She did not correct him. Before leaving, she glanced at me. For 1 second, something in her expression seemed to ask a question. Then Ethan touched her elbow and guided her toward the door. That evening, Thomas told me Melissa had been requesting old records. Birth certificate, tax documents, copies of identification. Mom said she was organizing things. My father stared into his coffee. "Your mother has been helping her." "With what?" "I do not know everything." "Dad." She made me promise not to ask. He lowered his voice. "There is a cedar box in the bedroom closet. Your mother keeps journals in it. She said that after the funeral, you and Melissa should open it together." "Why?" She would not tell me. On the 8th night, Judith's breathing became more difficult. Daniel offered to sit with my father while I slept, but I refused to leave the room. Shortly before dawn on Tuesday morning, my mother opened her eyes. "Laura." "I'm here." "Tell Melisse." She stopped to breathe. "What should I tell her?" "The door does not have to stay open forever, but she must choose which side she wants to stand on." I did not fully understand. "I'll tell her." Judith turned toward my father. Then she smiled faintly. I had a good life. She died with Thomas holding one hand and me holding the other. Daniel waited outside the bedroom until I called his name. The funeral was scheduled for Friday at a funeral home in Newton. For 3 days, I moved through arrangements as though grief were a task that could be completed through organization. Flowers, music, photographs, obituary, guest list. On Thursday evening, the funeral director called to confirm family seating. Your sister has confirmed, he said. Will she be alone? No. She listed her husband as accompanying her. Daniel looked at me from across the room. I thanked the director and ended the call. Ethan is coming. Daniel's expression became unreadable. Are you comfortable with me being there? You are my husband. I know. I am asking whether my history with him will make tomorrow harder. I thought about the office door, the returned ring, and the company Ethan blamed Daniel for damaging. Then I thought about my mother, who had spent her final days refusing to order me to forgive anyone. I want you beside me. Daniel reached for my hand. Then I will be there. That night, I opened the bedroom closet and found the cedar box. A folded note rested on top. For my daughters. Together, when you are ready. I closed the door. I did not know whether Melissa was ready. I was not certain I was. But the following morning, she would walk into our mother's funeral, wearing the life she had chosen, and Ethan Caldwell would be beside her. 6 years after I left Boston, the moment from the beginning of this story finally arrived. Rain covered Newton in a thin gray mist. Daniel and I reached the funeral home early. A problem with the seating plan pulled him away while I greeted relatives near the entrance. Then Melissa arrived. She wore a fitted black coat, diamonds, and the expression of a woman entering a room she intended to control. Ethan walked beside her. He looked older. Not dramatically, but in ways expensive clothing could not conceal. His face was leaner, his jaw held too tightly, and his confidence seemed constructed rather than natural. Melissa's hand rested on his arm. My old engagement ring caught the light above her wedding band. For an instant, I remembered placing it in the courier box. I wondered whether Ethan had given it to Melissa as romance, or as a permanent reminder that she possessed something that once belonged to me. After greeting our father, Melissa approached. Her gaze moved across my black dress. You look well. So do you. The exchange was polite enough for anyone listening. Then she leaned closer. 38, married, and your husband still let you come alone? I did not come alone. She looked around. I do not see anyone. Daniel returned before I could answer. He placed one hand at the small of my back. Everything is ready, love. Melissa's expression shifted. So, this is the husband no one ever talks about. I turned toward him. Daniel, this is my sister. Melissa's eyes moved over his face. Then Ethan looked at him. The color drained from Ethan's cheeks. His hand fell from Melissa's waist. Daniel regarded him calmly. Ethan. Ethan swallowed. You. Melissa looked between them. What is going on? Daniel extended his hand. We crossed paths professionally. Ethan hesitated before accepting it. Whitmore, he said quietly. It was not a greeting. It was recognition. Melissa stared at her husband. Daniel released Ethan's hand. I'm sorry for your loss. Then he guided me toward the family seating, without offering Ethan the public confrontation he clearly expected. During the service, Daniel sat beside me, while Thomas sat on my other side. I listened as people described Judith's kindness, stubbornness, and loyalty. Across the aisle, Melissa sat beside Ethan. At first, I tried not to watch them. Then I began noticing things. Melissa's phone remained in Ethan's hand. Whenever someone approached her, he answered questions first. When she attempted to stay beside our father after the service, Ethan touched her elbow. Not violently, firmly. Her body responded before her face did. She became still. An older family friend asked Melissa whether she would remain in Boston to help Thomas. We have not decided, Ethan answered. Melissa opened her mouth. His fingers tightened around her arm. She looked down. I remembered the calls during Judith's final days. Marriage means transparency. For the first time, I wondered whether Melissa's polished life was less a victory than a performance she had forgotten how to stop. Ethan avoided Daniel. Daniel did not pursue him. That restraint mattered. The man I had once planned to marry would have turned a funeral into a stage if humiliation benefited him. The man I married understood that grief did not belong to his business history. After most guests had left, Melissa approached me. "Can we talk?" Ethan was speaking to someone near the entrance. "Do you have permission?" Her expression hardened. "I do not need permission." But she glanced toward him before leading me into a private room. The moment the door closed, she crossed her arms. So this was the plan. What plan? Bring Daniel Whitmore here. Let Ethan see him. Let everyone see that you married someone more powerful. My mother died, Melissa. You always know how to look innocent. For 6 years, I had imagined what I might say if we were ever alone. None of those speeches felt necessary. Are you happy? The question stopped her. What? You said you got the man, the mansion, and the life I wanted. Are you happy? She laughed too quickly. You think because you married Whitmore you can judge me. I am not judging you. I am asking whether the life you display is real. Her face changed. Only for a second. Then the door opened slightly. Daniel looked inside. Everything all right? Yes. Melissa stared at him. Ethan says Northbridge sabotaged his company. Daniel's expression remained calm. Ethan's business is not a subject I intend to discuss at Judith's funeral. He closed the door. Melissa turned toward me. You knew? I learned before we married. And you still married him? I married Daniel because of who he is. Cynics happened before he met me. Ethan said Northbridge took Cynics to destroy him. Ethan signed the loans that placed his company at risk. Her head turned sharply. How do you know? I read the court records. Melissa said nothing. A cheap phone began vibrating inside her handbag. Not the expensive phone Ethan had been carrying. She opened the bag, silenced the device, and tried to close the zipper. I saw a thick envelope inside. A passport, bank statements, legal papers. What is that? Nothing. Melissa. She gripped the handbag against her body. Then her shoulders dropped. For the first time since entering the funeral home, she looked exhausted. The house is not ours. What? The cars are leased through the company. Half the jewelry was purchased as business expenses. The trips are paid for by people Ethan is trying to impress. I remained silent. She sank into a chair. The life you think I stole from you does not exist. Someone tried the handle. Melissa stood so quickly that the chair struck the wall. Ethan's voice came from the corridor. Melissa. Fear crossed her face. Real fear. Then she whispered, Do not tell him about the phone. I locked the door before Ethan could enter. Melissa is changing, I called. Silence followed. Then his footsteps moved away. Melissa stared at me. You lied for me. I gave you 5 minutes. Do not confuse that with trust. She nodded. It was the first time in years she accepted a boundary without fighting it. Tell me the truth. She sat down and opened the handbag. The second phone was inexpensive and nearly empty. No social media, no shared accounts, no tracking applications. The envelope contained copies of her birth certificate, passport, prenuptial agreement, bank statements, tax records, and documents bearing the name Caldwell Holdings. The house belongs to the holding company, she said. Ethan formed it before we married. The prenup classifies his existing business interests and anything held through the company as separate property. A prenup cannot stop you from filing for divorce. I know. The answer surprised me. I met a lawyer. How long ago? 4 months. My mother had known. The birth certificate. The tax records. The cedar box. The pieces began aligning. If you leave, what happens? I do not receive the house. The cars are leased through the company. Most of the accounts are under Ethan's control. I have one personal account, but he monitors transfers. Why? He says I cannot be trusted with money. Can you? The question was harsh, but necessary. Melissa looked down. Not always. I spent too much. I thought appearances were the only thing keeping us important. And after the company started failing, the more unstable everything became, the more Ethan needed us to look successful. What happened after Cynics? He told me Northbridge destroyed him. That is not what happened. I know that now. She removed several pages from the envelope. These are copies of loan documents. Ethan borrowed against projected revenue before the acquisition was approved. After cynics selected Northbridge, investors withdrew. He moved assets between companies and sold divisions. Are you accusing him of a crime? No. My lawyer told me to collect documents, not interpret them. That answer showed more judgment than the Melissa I remembered. What does Ethan control? Cards, schedule, phone, household accounts. He reads my messages. He says a wife should have nothing to hide. Has he hurt you? Her eyes moved away. Not in the way you mean. That is not an answer. He has never hit me. I waited. He blocks doors, takes my phone, breaks things. Once he drove for an hour while screaming because I had lunch with Mom without telling him. The room felt colder. Melissa's suffering did not erase what she had done to me. But I could recognize coercive control without converting her into an innocent person. How did Mom help? She kept copies of my records. She found the lawyer through a woman at church. She helped me open a private account. Why did she not tell me? I asked her not to. Why? Melissa gave a bitter laugh. Because admitting it to you would mean admitting that I destroyed our relationship for nothing. You did not destroy it for nothing. She looked at me. You destroyed it because you wanted what I had. The fact that Ethan disappointed you later does not make the original betrayal smaller. Her eyes filled with tears. She did not defend herself. I hated you, she said. Not because you hurt me, because every time you succeeded, I felt like proof that I had failed. That was never my responsibility. She lowered her eyes. I married Ethan, because winning him felt like winning against you. Then I spent years making sure no one saw what I had actually won. Outside, voices moved through the corridor. What is your plan? I have an apartment arranged through my lawyer. The lease begins Monday. On Tuesday morning, she will file the divorce petition. Does Ethan know? No. Does your lawyer know you plan to leave the house? Yes. She told me what I can take and what must remain. Transportation? Mom arranged for a woman from church to help, but after she became worse, I did not want to burden Dad. You cannot stay at our parents' house. Ethan will look there first. I know. What do you need from me? Melissa seemed stunned. I do not know. Think carefully. I am not giving you a large amount of money. I am not asking Daniel to destroy Ethan's company. I am not lying to a court, hiding assets, or removing evidence. I would never ask you to. You helped my fiancé lie to me for 6 months. I need the rules stated aloud. She accepted the accusation without argument. I need someone to know where I am, she said. I can do that. And I need Ethan not to discover the second phone. I will not tell him. Her breath broke. Why are you helping me? Because helping you leave a controlling situation is not the same as forgiving you. A knock sounded again. This time, it was Daniel. Laura? I opened the door. Ethan stood several feet behind him. His eyes moved from me to Melissa. What took so long? My sister and I were discussing our mother. He studied Melissa. Give me your bag. Her hand tightened around it. Daniel stepped slightly closer to me. Not threatening. Present. Melissa forced a laugh. I'm keeping it. Ethan's jaw moved. Then he noticed relatives watching from the reception room. His expression softened instantly. Of course. That transformation told me more than an outburst would have. Later that afternoon, Melissa returned to our parents' house without Ethan. She claimed she needed to help Thomas sort personal belongings. Too many relatives were present for Ethan to object publicly. Daniel took my father for a walk. Melissa and I entered the bedroom and removed the cedar box from the closet. The note remained on top. For my daughters. Together when you are ready. Inside were journals, childhood photographs, and 2 sealed envelopes. One was addressed to me, the other to Melissa. We opened the journal first. Judith had written about our childhood, our rivalry, and the mistakes she made by treating every conflict as something forced togetherness could repair. She did not excuse Melissa. She did not ask me to erase the past. One entry had been written shortly after Melissa first asked for help. Melissa came to me today, without makeup, jewelry, or Ethan. I almost did not recognize her. She told me she was afraid, not only of him, but of becoming a woman who could no longer survive without the life she once stole. Melissa covered her mouth. I continued reading. I told her that leaving Ethan would not automatically restore her sister. Freedom is not a reward for regret, it is the beginning of responsibility. The final entry was written with an unsteady hand. For Laura, you do not owe access to anyone who harmed you. For Melissa, regret is useless unless it changes your behavior. For both my daughters, if you ever sit together again, do not perform forgiveness. Tell the truth and allow time to decide what remains. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Melissa opened her envelope. Inside was the lawyer's contact information and a key to a safe deposit box containing certified copies of her documents. My envelope contained a short letter. You have spent years believing strength means needing nothing from the people who hurt you. Sometimes strength also means knowing exactly what you can offer without abandoning yourself. I folded the letter. Melissa wiped her face. I am sorry. The words were quiet. I know that is not enough. No, it isn't. She nodded. I will prove it through what I do. That is the only apology that matters. The following morning, Daniel and I met Melissa's attorney at a cafe away from the neighborhood. The plan was detailed. Melissa would leave early Monday, while Ethan attended a lender meeting. She would take clothing, medication, personal records, and property clearly belonging to her. She would not empty accounts, remove company property, or take financial originals that belonged in the house. The attorney had arranged temporary housing and would file the petition Tuesday morning. Daniel offered no legal advice. He only asked whether the location was secure and whether Melissa had emergency contacts. Afterward, he and I walked to the car. You handled that carefully, he said. I still do not know how I feel. You do not have to decide now. Monday morning arrived. At 7, Ethan's name appeared on my phone. I did not answer. A message from Melissa arrived seconds later. I'm out. Daniel looked up from the kitchen table. She made it? Yes. The phone rang again. Then again. By 8, I had 14 missed calls. By 10:43. Shortly before noon, the number reached 99. Ethan left messages accusing me, Daniel, my mother, and Melissa's lawyer of conspiring against him. I listened to none of them. For 6 years, I had imagined revenge as the moment Ethan and Melissa finally understood what they had done to me. Instead, the moment arrived quietly. My sister had left the mansion she once used to measure her victory. Ethan had lost control of the story, and I no longer needed to watch either of them suffer to know I had survived. Melissa filed for divorce on Tuesday morning. It did not end quickly. Ethan challenged financial disclosures, disputed personal property, and claimed Melissa had been manipulated by my family. The prenuptial agreement remained largely enforceable. Melissa did not receive the mansion, the company vehicles, or ownership in the business interests Ethan held before their marriage. But the agreement could not force her to remain his wife. Her attorney separated her from debts she had never signed, negotiated access to personal funds, and documented Ethan's controlling behavior without exaggerating what could not be proven. The process lasted 9 months. During that time, Melissa lived in a small second-floor apartment with worn carpet, a leaking bathroom faucet, and a kitchen barely large enough for one person. She found work at a community center coordinating workshops for women returning to employment after divorce, caregiving, or financial dependence. The salary was modest. The work was real. Our relationship did not repair itself through one funeral, one journal, or one apology. At first, we exchanged practical messages. Did you arrive safely? Dad has an appointment on Thursday. The lawyer needs another copy of the tax record. Months passed before we had coffee alone. Melissa did not ask whether I had forgiven her. I did not promise that I eventually would. Trust returned in pieces so small, they might have been invisible to anyone else. She arrived when she said she would. She stopped lying when the truth made her look bad. She no longer compared our lives. When she apologized, she did not attach excuses. Halfway through the divorce, Ethan offered to reconcile if Melissa publicly blamed her departure on grief after our mother's death. She refused. That decision cost her access to money he had promised to release. It also showed me that she was finally willing to lose something in order to tell the truth. Caldwell Technologies continued restructuring. The holding company eventually sold the house to cover obligations. Business publications described Ethan's fall as a combination of debt, overexpansion, and failed acquisitions. Daniel never celebrated. Northbridge did not buy Ethan's remaining company at a discount. Daniel did not use his connections to humiliate him. "I already won the only transaction that matters to me," he said one evening. "What transaction was that?" "You agreed to have coffee with me a second time." Nearly 1 year after my mother's funeral, I stood in our Chicago bathroom holding a pregnancy test. I had taken so many that I no longer allowed myself to interpret hope. Then the second line appeared. I sat on the floor and cried. Daniel found me there. For one frightened second, he thought something was wrong. I handed him the test. He stared at it, then at me. "Is this real?" "I think so." He knelt beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. After the doctor confirmed the pregnancy, my father told Melissa. She called that evening. "I heard the news." "Yes. Congratulations, Laura." I waited for the old comparison. It never came. "I'm happy for you," she said. "Truly. Thank you. I know I have no right to ask, but I hope I can know your child someday. You can earn a place." She released a shaky breath. "That is more than I expected." After the call, I opened a new journal. On the first page, I began writing to the child Daniel, and I had once stopped believing would come. "My dearest child, people may lie to you. Plans may collapse. Someone you love may choose themselves at your expense. Do not believe forgiveness means reopening every door. Do not believe boundaries make you cruel. And never confuse revenge with healing." For years, I thought victory would arrive when Ethan and Melissa regretted what they had done. I was wrong. Ethan lost money, status, and control. Melissa lost the life she once displayed as proof that she had defeated me. But their losses were not my victory. My victory was waking beside a man whose love did not require me to doubt myself. It was building a career no betrayal could erase. It was sitting across from my sister without needing to punish her or rescue her. It was carrying my child beneath my heart, and understanding that the past had no claim on the home we were creating. The best revenge was never watching them lose everything. It was realizing they could no longer take anything from me,